Welcome to Talking Postgres, a monthly podcast that was previously called Path to CitusCon, but we renamed it back in July 2024. In this podcast, we focus on the human side of Postgres databases and open source. I want to say thank you to the team at Microsoft for sponsoring this community conversation, and I'm your host, Claire Giordano. Today's topic is how I got started as a developer and in Postgres with an amazing guest. I want to introduce Tom Lane. Tom is a Postgres committer and major contributor. He works at Crunchy Data, and he is prolific when it comes to Postgres development. Tom is a member of the Postgres core team, and he started contributing to Postgres, I guess, about 26 years ago, back in 1998. And over time, he has worked on most parts of the Postgres code. He likes working on the planner and anything that involves SQL semantics. Tom earned a PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University and has been involved with the Postgres project, like I said before, since 1998. Welcome, Tom.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited. Today's episode will probably be a little bit longer than usual, but we'll see how we do. The topic, how I got started as a developer and in Postgres, is I think fascinating because it's so interesting to find out how people got to be where they are and also why they do what they do. So let's dive in with hmm. We'll start with when you first got involved in programming.
Okay, well, I was in high school. Um, the math department at my high school had a teletype, an ASR 33 teletype that was hooked up on dial-up modem to uh, Honeywell something or other, I think a 316 that lived down at the county school building, county school board building. And they would spend, I don't know, maybe like one or two regular math class sessions on programming. But the machine was just sitting there after hours, and kids could go and play with it after school if they wanted. And I was a geek, so I wanted to play with this thing. And there were maybe about a dozen others who felt the same way. And we would go and write little programs. Uh, we had, let me see, the Honeywell had a basic interpreter of some kind, and we had a couple of spare teletypes on which we would punch up our programs on paper tape so that when we went to the live machine, we could just feed them into the tape reader rather than having to type online. Um, and let's see. The only program I can specifically remember working on back then was I wrote a program to solve cubic equations, not because I had a need for that functionality exactly. I found an algorithm for that in a book, and it seemed like the right size of problem to learn BASIC with. So that's what I did.
All right. So you hung out after school in the math lab, started programming. You already knew that you were a geek, apparently. And then you went to Carnegie Mellon for university. Is that right? Okay. And it was not your plan to become a computer person. I know this because you
Yeah,
told me before the show. Your goal, is it true that your goal was to get a job designing pinball machines?
exactly. Um, I loved and still love pinball, pool, bowling, anything involving, you know, aiming at a target. I'm not any good at those things, mind you, but I love it. And I just thought that the coolest job there could possibly be would be to design and build pinball machines for a living. So when I went off to CMU, I got accepted into the College of Engineering, and the way they work things there is you don't actually have to declare a specific major till your sophomore year. Before that, you're just an engineer. So I took the introductory courses for mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, figuring that probably mechanical would be the thing to do because back then pinball machines were mostly mechanical. Obviously, if I'd foreseen what they'd be like now, I would have thought a lot harder about the electrical side of it. Um, but at any rate, I took those introductory courses, and the double E's sent their best, most charismatic professor to teach the introductory class because they understood they were in competitions with the other departments to get freshmen to sign up with them, right? Um, and meanwhile, the Meckies made no impact on me whatsoever. So there I was. I became an electrical engineering major as a sophomore. Um, and I also took an introductory class in computer science, um, just because it was there. As I said, I did not foresee that as being my future. Um, but I did okay in that course. And the professor who was teaching it pulled me aside and said, "You really ought to go apply to be a research assistant in the department because you're good at this." Um, and so I said, okay, because, I needed a part time job and that sounded way better than flipping burgers. So I went and applied and got the job. And I forget what they had me doing for the first year or so, but after that, I got involved with the Hydra project, which was one of the very first symmetric multiprocessors that ever existed. And spent, evenings and weekends and summers hacking on that for 2 or 3 years. Um, and that CS101 course is actually the only formal training I had on computers up until grad school. Everything else I knew I learned from being a research assistant. So it's very, unstructured way to learn anything about computers.
And as a
Um,
research assistant, when you were learning about computer science and programming, was that all like self-taught, or were you actually spending time with some of the professors or some of the other grad students or TAs who were teaching you as well?
I can't recall if there was any formal training going on. They would say, "Go do this," and I would learn whatever I had to learn in order to do it.
Okay. And was the pay as good as that of flipping burgers or
Slightly better,
okay.
but not by much. Uh,
Okay. So the 4 years go by and you
mhm.
graduate and you have a degree in electrical engineering from CMU and you enter the job market, and then what happened next?
Um, yeah, well, the job market was fairly decent that year, so I had 2 or 3 job offers, and I went to Hewlett Packard just because they were the coolest of the bunch, um,
Okay.
and went to their, uh, at the time it was called the, uh, Stop Calculator division in Colorado. Now what they were not the people making, the iconic handheld calculators. That was a division in Oregon. But what the Colorado people were making were things that sat on a desk and um, typically would run BASIC or something like that. And they were basically just the supersized brothers of the handheld thingies. Um, I fit right into that because at the time, uh, HP really didn't want to hire CS majors. I guess they thought it was a fake specialty or something. But since I had a double E degree, I could get in the door. But nonetheless, they were building these things that desperately required operating systems and basic interpreters and what have you. So they really needed people who could program. Um, and there were not that many of us in the building. Um, so yeah, I fit right in and I did okay there. And we made some pretty cool stuff. The machines that I had the most to do with were probably about the equivalent power of VAX 11780, but they sat on your desk. They weren't in a cabinet full of equipment. So I was, and back in the day, it was about one MIPS was what these machines could do. And it was a lot for the time.
I think it's fascinating that these were effectively desktop computers. You're talking about the HP 9800 series, but they were
Right.
marketed as calculators or desktop calculators. And
Yeah.
apparently, and I learned this from doing some research on Wikipedia, so you tell me if I'm right or wrong. Um, but it was to make purchasing and sales and procurement easier because apparently some companies had different procedures for purchasing computers. So HP found it more effective to sell these as desktop calculators.
I can believe
Does
that,
that
but, I was an R&D engineer. I had nothing to do with sales, so I can't say
okay?
of my own knowledge that that's how it worked.
And you said it was the coolest place to go, HP at the time, compared to your other job offers. Like, what was cool about it back then?
Well, they just had a reputation of being an engineers company, um, but it was a very open, decentralized kind of, situation. The founders, uh, Packard and Bill Hewlett, were still active at that point, and they would show up fairly regularly and just wander around the labs and talk to people. Management by walking around was the, buzz phrase then, and that was what they actually did. I don't recall that I ever met them in person, but there was probably at least 50-50 chance that I would have if I'd hung on another couple of years. Um, and in general, the place was very much another buzz phrase that they had was design for the next bench, build something that the guy sitting beside you would want to use. Um, so it's very engineering driven company. And I get the impression that that culture is gone entirely, but um, I left after 5 years, mainly because my wife did not like Colorado and wanted to come home to Pittsburgh. Um, and so, yeah, I needed an excuse to leave without burning any bridges. And so going back to grad school was the easiest thing to do there.
Okay, so you moved back to Pennsylvania
Mhm.
and grad school. So we're talking Carnegie Mellon again. Is that right?
Right, right. Because, I had been involved with the department as an undergrad for years before that. So I knew that I would easily get accepted if I applied. My professor, Bill Wolf, who had run Hydra, would certainly give me a good recommendation letter. Um, when I got back, he told me that I walked into his office and he said, um, some of the guys on the team started asking where you were after you left. I said, well, I haven't seen him. And Bill said he graduated, and they said, what? I didn't see his thesis defense. They all thought I was a grad student, apparently. So, uh, but nope, I wasn't at the time, but now I became one. And, so I had expected to sign up with Bill as being one of his students. But the second thing he said to me was, I'm leaving because he had gotten a job as, I don't recall if he went immediately, but sometime later than that, he was director of National Science Foundation. And he'd been given either that job or some precursor to it. So he left, and there I was stuck looking for another thesis advisor. Uh, Ended up with John Bentley, which was fun, but then he got a job at Bell Labs and left. Um, and so my third advisor, who finally stuck around long enough for me to get a thesis out, was Mary Shaw. Uh, and
Okay, so
uh,
I think it's 9 years, start to finish at CMU. Is that right?
yeah, it was a long time. Um, there
And
is,
there's there's something I just have to ask you about. Um, Apparently, grad students back in those days, I don't know if it's still true if you're getting a PhD in computer science at CMU, but you had all these kind of boring and menial tasks that you had to do. I guess the professors and the staff wanted to kind of get the most value out of their grad students. Um,
something like that. There's the idea that grad students are unpaid slave labor, basically. Um, I don't know how the other schools run it, but at CMU's CS department, they had a list of things that needed. It's called the Lieberman queue, I guess, after whoever had invented this way of running things. And you're expected to take a job or two off that this and do it while you were there. Um, a lot of them were pretty low level jobs. The one I specifically recall was loading the departmental Coke machine, um, which um, I actually wrote something up about it after the fact for some. There was a Usenet group with was interested in history of computing, and I wrote a little thing about how that all worked, and I believe there's a link to it. Hopefully, Ari will stick into the chat. Um, but a lot of them were just not very exciting jobs like that. But when it was my turn to go and sign up for something, one thing that was available was running the Usenet news software there. And I thought that sounded way more interesting than loading Coke machines. So I signed up for that. And there I was being their Usenet sysadmin for, I don't remember how long, but several years. Uh, didn't really have to run the hardware or anything. I just had to keep the software up to date and correctly configured and going. So
Yeah, I'm looking
that
at
was it,
the write-up on the only Coke machine on the internet, and there's a
which was
whole
true at
bunch
the
of
time. It's not anymore. Um,
yeah, but I think one of the things you wrote is that no real programmer can function without caffeine, so the machine is super popular or something like that.
right.
Um,
Yeah, I recall hearing that it had the highest sales volume of any Coke machine in the area for some period of time back in the 70s. So, yep, there was a lot of Coke being consumed, and I consumed a lot of it too. It's still my drink of choice. I've got a glass of Diet Coke beside me right now. So,
got it. For me, I had my double espresso this morning, so I'm done with caffeine for the day. And anyone who knows me well will say that one double espresso is enough. I try to talk slower on this podcast than I do naturally in life. Okay, the Usenet sysadmin job, though, that you had, obviously in parallel with your graduate student work and your work on your thesis and all of that, um,
mm,
was the software that you were maintaining open source?
was. So that
Okay,
was much my first exposure to open source in the sense that we know it today, where there's an intentional desire to make code freely available. There was obviously, in the academic environment, there's a ton of code kicking around that was effectively unlicensed because nobody cared about that, right? Um, and you could have a copy of it if you wanted, but there wasn't a formal license saying that it was okay for you to use it.
okay,
Whereas with the Usenet code, there actually was a license saying, this is available and free to use and so on. So that was kind of my first exposure to that concept.
okay, which obviously becomes very, very important as you progress in your career. All right,
Right.
so 9 years at grad school, um, trying not to have to fill the Coke machine, a sysadmin job at for Usenet. Could you live on your grad student stipend? Did it
No,
take
not
all of
really.
your okay,
Um, if I'd been single and living in a garret, it might have done, but I had a wife who did not want to live that way. So I needed an outside income, and um, I met up with a guy who was interested in doing aftermarket support for those Hewlett Packard machines that I'd worked on. Um,
desktop
because
desktop desktop calculators.
right, right. Um, because this was a few years later, and HP was no longer particularly interested in me doing new software for them or anything like that. So they were aware of what we were doing, and they were fine with it, and made a decent living for a few years of that. Um, but, that was part of the reason why it took 9 years was because I was spending a good chunk of my time off doing that rather than doing grad studenty things. Um,
And
you
then
know,
you've got your undergraduate degree, you worked at HP, you're working on your PhD. you've got your first exposure to open source, but had you taken a databases class yet? Did you know have any inkling that you would someday spend all of your working hours focused on a database?
No, there was at that time, as far as I can recall, there was nobody at CMU who cared about databases at all. Certainly nobody who thought they were cool. Um,
Okay, so
so
Andy Pavlo was not a professor there yet.
no, I don't know when he came, but it was after my time.
Okay. Um, so when do you first get introduced to Postgres or any database for relational database for that matter?
Right? Um, so going back to this outside business, which was called structured software systems, and that's where the SSS in my uh, still existing domain name came from. Um, like I said, we've been doing aftermarket support for HP's machines for probably about 10 years, and then that market started to dry up because HP weren't making those particular models anymore, and the demand for support was going downhill. So we looked around for something to do, and we said, you know what we'll do? We will enrich the stock market by modeling price series. And you know, maybe this was a crazy idea, but it actually worked for a while. Um, anyway, we spent a year or so developing some algorithms and writing support code for this. And when we were ready to trade, we said, "Oh, we need a database to store our trades in, so that we know what we've got and what we need to sell or buy." Um, and we were starting this on a shoestring, right? Because we were living off what we'd built up on, during the years of working on Hewlett Packard stuff. So we didn't have a lot of money to spare at this point. And I went around and looked at what was available in open source databases. And there were basically two alternatives. There was Postgres and there was MySQL. Um, and we also looked at Oracle for about half a second until we found out what the licensing fees were like. Um, so I went and looked at the code base of Postgres, and it was pretty clean and readable. And I said, "Yeah, this looks decent." And I looked at the code base of MySQL, and it was horrid. No comments anywhere, very unreadable coding style. And I said, I do not trust this thing. I'm not going to, use it for something that my income depends on. And so we chose to use Postgres, and we set out when we started trading. We actually made some money for a few years, but then it seemed like the markets changed and the algorithms we had didn't work as well anymore. I think what was actually happening, there's still people making money with that sort of trading, but they're doing it on these incredibly short time scales. They actually worry about speed of light to the exchanges, and they're doing it on millisecond trading levels. So the same thing we were doing, but we did not have the resources to do it in that kind of way. So, you know, after a while, our trading models stopped working very well. But in the meantime, I had just gotten involved in Postgres. The first thing that I had to fix in it was we wanted to run it on HP machines, obviously, because that's what we had. And it, there was a port to HPUX in existence, but when we tried to use it, we found a few bugs. And so I had to send in patches for that. And the next thing that I ran into that didn't work as well as I could wish was we wanted to use the listen and notify commands Postgres already had to send signals between the machines we had that were doing the trading models and the machines that we were actually trading on. And I don't recall the details of what was wrong, but there were things about listen and notify that didn't work very well. So I had to go fix them. Um, I had to fix some other things, this, that. And gradually, I just got sucked down this rabbit hole of discovering there are actually all sorts of interesting things about this piece of software. And particularly the planner, I got really interested in as time went on. So after 2 or 3 years of this, I realized I was basically shirking SSS work completely and spending all my time on Postgres stuff, which, is clearly not terribly sustainable. And right about then, GreatBridge started up, which was, I think, the first, Postgres-focused company. And they offered me a job to, come and spend full time hacking on Postgres. I said, "I'm in." So that was where I switched over from just doing this as a dilettante to actually getting paid for it.
Okay, so you were a user of Postgres before you became a contributor. Um, m- uh, in the context of this trading model that you and your partner at Structured Software Systems had built, right? Did you hear me? Sorry, is there something wrong with my microphone?
No, but you seem to trail off without actually asking questions, so
Oh,
just
okay.
waiting
So
for you.
no, I was just confirming. You were user first at Structured Software Systems before you started submitting patches to fix the problems with listen and notify, etc. Is that right?
Correct. So,
Okay.
yeah, and initially, my intention was just to be a user and not particularly to get involved with it.
But then there was a rabbit hole. Okay, but
Yep.
we've jumped over something. While you after you got your degree
Mm,
and while you were still at Structured Software Systems, presumably working on this trading model, um,
mm,
you also got involved in image compression in JPEG. And
right.
you have software running on Mars, so I think we've gotta talk about this. Like, how did that happen?
Okay, so, as you said, this was right after, I graduated. I felt that graduated from, grad school, not undergrad. I had this shiny new, PhD, and good chunk of that I could, be thankful to US taxpayers for because that was where that stipend was coming from. So I felt like, I had to give something back. And the obvious way to do that was to write some open source code for something or other. But I didn't know quite what to do. And what I remembered was when I had been net news admin at CMU, I had a huge problem with the amount of bandwidth that was being spent on GIFs being shipped around on Usenet, because everyone wanted to put up their cat pictures and what have you. And so the 64 encoding GIFs were the technology of the day. And they were enormous, at least, by the standards of the T1 line, that was the best anybody had for passing news around. And, if you were interested in photographs, GIFs do not have very good image quality for that. So that was, a sore spot that had existed for some time. And right about then, there was this new standard that came out, written by the uh, Joint Photographic Experts Group, which is a committee of, I think, ISO and I forget the name of the US standards body that is equivalent to ISO, but that was where the joint came from. And they had written this image compression standard based on an entirely new mathematical approach called discrete cosine transforms. And we were hearing great things about it. So, both as to how well it could compress and as to the quality of the resulting images. So I said, let's see if we can write something here. Um, I don't want to sound like I did it all myself. There were about a dozen other people who were involved at the beginning, and people had gotten together through being interested in image compression on Usenet. And we wrote this code, and it actually worked. And it wasn't terribly fast in the beginning because we didn't know how to optimize it. But when you're talking about an image you're sending across a dial-up line, it doesn't really matter if it takes you an extra 10 seconds to decompress it, so that wasn't a problem. And it really solved the problem nicely because, for a tenth of the size of a GIF, you could have a significantly better looking resulting photograph. And, so factor of 10 better is the kind of number that gets the world's attention. And that meant that our code just took over Usenet by storm pretty much. And then people started using it on the World Wide Web, which was a new thing. And uh, that's how that all ended up. Other people have tried to supplant that original JPEG stuff off and on, but kind of hard to do because if you don't have that factor of 10 advantage over what's there, you can't get people's attention. So I think it'll be a while before that goes away.
Well, and
But anyway,
the
to your original point, yeah, the uh, engineering cameras on the Perseverance rover, I know are using libjpeg because Joe Conway pointed me to a paper that said so. Um, and I'm not less sure about other Mars missions. I recall hearing that some of the orbiters had JPEG-based code, but it was not based on our library. It was some other implementation. But I know for a fact that Perseverance is using my code.
And then I have a quote in front of me that focuses on the open source side of things too. And this is actually a quote from you, I think. 30 years later, it's still the case that the existence of libjpeg with liberal license terms is why JPEG is everywhere and the potential alternatives are not. You said that,
Yeah,
right?
that was part of the discussion we had before the show. Yeah, what I was describing just now is the technical merits, but I think the fact that libjpeg was open source also had a great deal to do with the ease with which it got taken up. Um, and that is another thing that some of the folks who have tried to replace them didn't quite grasp. They would put out stuff that had some kind of restriction on it. It wouldn't get used. So, those are the two bits of the recipe that I have for the next person who wants to revolutionize the world. It has to be good. It has to be free.
Okay, so once you got involved in Postgres, though, and like you said, you realized you were shirking your structured software systems work, I'm assuming you also had to hand over your libjpeg work too, as Postgres took up more and more of your like time. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I kind of after about 97 or 90, no, must have been later than that, 99 or so. Um, I kind of stopped having any more time for libjpeg, and I was feeling extremely guilty about that for a period of several years. But eventually, some other people stepped into the breach. Um, the current crowd is led by a guy, I believe, by the name of Daryl Commander. I haven't spoken to him in a few years, but they're still out there maintaining it. It's now called JPEG Turbo or something like that, maybe, but it's descendant of the same code.
All right, so let's dive into Postgres now, because that's what you did back in the late 90s. Um, how did you like what parts of the systems did you work on the most? You mentioned the planner earlier, and why? What were you
Well,
drawn to? What was the magnet?
it's kind of hard to say, really. Um, I just found it interesting as a concept that we've got this exceedingly non-procedural language, and something has to figure out how to make that into something that a computer can execute. So it's a little bit. I should back up here. In my uh, grad student days, I'd been mostly into programming language development and compilers, things like that. So I understood how those worked, but they were all quite, you know, procedural languages that directly express an algorithm, and you could translate into something that a computer could do. Whereas with SQL, It's not procedural at all, and you have to devise a query plan that something that your code knows what to deal with. So, so that's probably what attracted me to the planner. Um, I did spend a lot of time on all other parts of the code, but most of that was in the vein of fixing bugs. Because one of the things that was salient about Postgres in the early days was it had been um, academic software in its origin. There's a great quote from Joe Hellerstein to the effect that Postgres is bloatware by design. It was built to house PhD theses. Um, and
I
that was
love
what
that.
uh, it was. That was what it did. And one of the principal attributes of PhD theses is that you're not required to fix every last bug in what you have written. So they didn't. And we were trying to make it into uh, production quality code, and we had to go around and try to find and fix all those bugs. So that was probably how I came by the how I got to a state where I could say that I'd looked at most of the code at one time or another. In the last 5 or 10 years, enough people that aren't me have been doing enough stuff that I can't really claim to be familiar with all of the code anymore, but there was a period where I could be.
And then I think you mentioned Great Bridge a while ago,
Mm,
but I know after they folded, because they folded, right? Then you went to Red
yeah.
Hat with
Yeah,
Salesforce.
they
Okay.
collapsed in the 2001 dot-com bust, which a lot of us were not particularly happy about. We thought, if companies are feeling poor, then there's all the more reason to be interested in open source stuff, right? So we thought this was a great opportunity, but the people who were running the company didn't see it that way, and they just decided to just shut it down. Um, but I was fortunate I got a job at Red Hat where they let me continue to work on Postgres. And they said, well, you got to spend 10% of your time packaging Postgres and MySQL and a few other related packages. I said, yeah, I'll take that trade. And that's what I did for, let's see, I was at Red Hat for a good 10 years, um, doing basically that. And then after that, I went to Salesforce for a little bit. And that was fun, but um, it was basically eating too much of my time doing non-community stuff, and I decided I didn't like that. So now I am at Crunchy Data. It's an even better deal. They basically let me spend 100% of my time on community Postgres. So can't complain about that.
So amongst all these companies, though, other than maybe Salesforce, you've been able to spend the bulk of your time working on Postgres open source. Is that, I mean, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah. And you still think so.
Yep.
Um, but it's an interesting aspect of the Postgres open source business model that there are employers, not just Crunchy Data, but including Crunchy Data, who
Mm.
pay people to work nearly full time on upstream open source. It's kind of how it's, I don't know, it's just part of the economic model, I suppose, that keeps Postgres alive.
Yeah, I mean, most, if not all, these companies have derivative products or things that they build on top of Postgres, and so they have economic interest in the open source project continuing to thrive. And I guess, that's why they're willing to pay us to do what we do. But yeah, it's kind of model that you might not think would come to exist, but here we are.
All right, so I have the rest of this conversation today. We've spent a lot of time figuring out like how you got your start as a developer, as a programmer, how you learned, where you learned. But now we're just going to talk Postgres for the rest of the
Okay.
conversation. And I have most of my questions are about your work as a developer and contributor, author, committer, reviewer, et cetera, et cetera. But you're also on this thing called the Postgres core team, which I don't want to assume all of our listeners even know what that is. So can you tell us what that is and like who you serve with and why it's important?
Yeah. So the core team is basically a steering committee. Uh, we Where it started was that back immediately after Berkeley had decided Postgres was not research anymore, there had been a few outside users of Postgres even back when it was research, but um, not that many. I don't know exactly how things worked, how they communicated with the university. But anyway, once Berkeley decided it wasn't research anymore, they kind of put an open source license on it and threw it over the wall. And some of these outside users picked it up and decided to start making it into a product essentially, or sorry, into a product quality thing. Um, there were about 4 people who were initially doing all the work of fixing bugs and integrating patches for other people who are also fixing bugs. And so that was the genesis of the core team. Was I think there were 4 to begin with. Um, and most of them, I think the only one who's still active out of that original group is Bruce Momjian. Uh, Mark Fournier is still around on the fringes of the project, but he doesn't do anything with the code anymore. Um, at any rate, originally those guys basically were the project, and so they had say over everything, like when the releases would be, and how we would deal with this, and who would get to be a committer, and so on. Um, but obviously, a group of that size can't deal with it all. As this project gets bigger. So there was a period of um, basically delegating responsibilities. And over time, I was about to say we, and up to now, I was talking about core as being, some other guys. They added me to core in, I guess, '99 when Great Bridge first approached the community and wanted to know uh, how they could be involved in a nice way. And so the 4 guys who were part of core at this point said, "We better get some more people involved so we can talk to them, with a more representative group of the uh, community." And so they had me and Jan Vik. And at that point, there were 6 people on core, and we went off and talked to Great Bridge and helped them organize. And they ended up hiring several of us, not just me. But anyways, moving on from there, it became obvious that we needed more people involved in running different aspects of the community. So a large chunk of what Core has done since then is to delegate responsibilities that originally were theirs by default. So there are now separate groups running, for instance, fundraising. Uh, the infrastructure is managed by a separate group of people. Uh, Code of conduct committee is sorry, code of conduct committee is a different group of people, and so on and so on.
Security.
And what uh, security team, right? Release team. That there's overlap. Most of the core members sit on one or more of these other subcommittees as well, but there are a ton more people involved, and all of them taken together. And what core remains to do basically is deal with stuff those committees don't want to deal with. Um, so we occasionally step in for like discipline problems or if people can't come to a solution. But I don't quite want to say that we're figureheads, but we don't actually do that much day to day as core. Uh, Obviously, we're all quite busy, but to the extent we're running the community, most of the work that we're doing is done via these other subcommittees.
Okay. So, there was a question on the chat that I want to make sure we touch on before we move on. Um, and Melanie was curious about uh, when that flip happened, when you were a user of Postgres who started getting interested in these rabbit holes, you were submitting patches. Um, when did you was there a moment when you realized that you wanted to work full time on Postgres, or that you might want to drop your other responsibilities and have that just become your job full time?
Uh,
Or was it a
well, I actually
slow
did
evolution?
that, Um, let's see, I joined, Great Bridge sometime in 2000, and probably for about a year before that, I've been having feeling that this is something I might want to do, but, yeah, it wasn't until they made me an offer that I said, "Yeah, I'm gonna do it."
Okay, so it sounds like it was a combination of your interest, but also the opportunity being given to you. Is that
Yeah,
a
very
fair
much so.
summary? Okay. Okay, cool. So, earlier I asked you to confirm that you were a Postgres user first before you became a developer, and
Mm.
a contributor and author and all of that. I'm curious whether you think um, that influenced you. Did your work at Structured Software Systems, where you had to rely on Postgres, right, to store various things in your trading model, has that influenced how you look at the Postgres project, what you think about when you're authoring things?
Yeah, it's made me aware of, I guess, the need to talk to end users. One of the things that I missed when I was at Hewlett Packard was that, the engineers all sat in our R&D lab, and we'd talk to each other, and the next bench only goes so far. You you're really better off if you can talk to actual people using your product, but at least at HP, there were layers of sales guys and so forth between you and them. Um, so one of the things I really like about the Postgres environment is that, you are interacting on the mailing list with actual everyday users, and you get to hear about their problems. And so that's why I pay as much attention to the mailing list as I do, is it gives me ideas about, what do we need to improve, and maybe even ideas about exactly how to do it, but at least I get a feeling for where the pain points are in a very direct way that I think you have a hard time getting in a traditional company.
Yeah, there can be, especially in a large company, a lot of levels between you and a user.
Mm.
Although I suppose the internet has closed some of those, right? There are some feedback loops that can be direct. Um, someone complaining on Twitter about a
Mm.
product, I suppose. But okay.
Yeah. Some companies I think do that better than others. It's certainly possible to interact directly with your users if you choose to do so.
And then I started to do the math. Basically, I was watching this interview with Ed Sheeran, and he was talking about this classic thing that you hear about, musician Ed Sheeran. I mean, this classic thing that a lot of people talk about. Maybe I think I first heard the term from Malcolm Gladwell. But I'm not sure what the source was. But this notion of 10,000 hours, this notion of it takes a lot of commitment and time to become expert at something. And so then I did the math based on your 26 years in Postgres, and you have spent, I believe, more than 10,000 hours on Postgres. Um,
That's certainly.
and then I guess the question is like, do you feel like you got better over time? If you look
Yeah.
at, say, your early patches versus your current patches, like how are things changed?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, quite a lot of years to reach the point of having looked at most of the source code. Um, and I continue to learn things about what's connected to what and what sort of development methods lead to something that's going to be maintainable further down the road versus not so maintainable. Um, so yeah, I've clearly gotten better at this as I went along, and I think I continue to do so. Uh, just got to be good at anything. It just takes a lot of study and work.
Um, what about failures? Like, have you I think it's fair to say that some people are intimidated by you or a lot of people look up to you, but you're human. I'm assuming there've been failures along the way, and, do
Lots and
any
lots.
stories come to mind? And do the failures actually make you better? Or
Mm, sometimes you learn not to do that again, but uh, we're all far from perfect. If you look through, uh, if you look through the commit log, there are plenty of places where I've fixed problems that I created earlier. It's just something that happens, and you've got to deal with it. I think that's one of the interesting things about working in open source is that your failures are inherently extremely public. You can't look the other way and pretend it didn't happen because there it is in the commit log. Anybody to see, and you just have to own up to it and deal with it. Uh, so I've gotten better at that just by force of experience. Um, let's see, it's discussion about for the show. I don't recall if you specifically asked me about what I thought my worst ever bug was, uh, or if I came up with that as a topic myself. But anyway, I do have a candidate for what that is. Uh, Bug was actually a security problem, CVE 2013-1899, which rose from what I thought was simple refactoring, just moving some code around. And what I was sloppy about there was the separation between trusted and untrusted command line switches, which enabled somebody who was just attempting to send a login. I mean, they hadn't even gotten authenticated. They could send some stuff that would be interpreted by the server as a trusted command line switch. Um, and the attacks that we mentioned in the commit message were bad enough, but there were things that the security team thought of that we still haven't admitted in public 10 years later because they were so awful. I don't remember the details, but I remember that they were pretty awful. Um,
I think you
so,
just touched on something really important though, which is when you work on an open source project, there's a lot of sunlight on your successes, but also on your mistakes. And I don't know if that means you have to develop a thick skin or you just have to develop grace, right? To accept that everyone's going to make mistakes sometimes and everyone's going to be human, but you have to kind of help each other find those mistakes before they impact too many people, I guess.
yeah, I think there's some of both of that. Um, I've, I think I've learned a little more grace as I went along in this project. At least, to the extent of trying to be more polite on the mailing list and things like that. And it's also true that you need to have a thick skin to some extent, um, because as you said, all this is just happening in public, and you're going to be embarrassed in public. And there's just no way to dodge that fact.
And I guess one of the things that I've tried hard to do is if I'm not careful, I can dwell on my mistakes, like almost like a replay in your mind. And that's just not productive. And it doesn't help. It just creates stress or anxiety or whatever. So I don't let myself do that anymore. It's kind of like you process it, you learn from it, but then you're going to have to let it go. I don't know about you, but that's what I do.
Yeah, I don't find that I tend to dwell on my mistakes. Think about and see if I can learn from it. It's still true that one of the best debugging techniques I know is when you identify a mistake, to look around and say, where else did we make the same mistake? Um, so yeah, that's sort of a version of learning from your mistakes, I guess, but it's something you have to do as best you can.
I've never heard someone put it just like that before. Where else did we make this mistake? And then you canvas for it and hopefully
Mm.
fix more. Okay, I like that. You mentioned mailing lists. Now, for people who are not familiar with the Postgres community's development process, there are. I'll try to summarize this. You tell me if I'm right or wrong. But there are these public mailing lists. You can go to post. You can search on PostgreSQL.org, Postgres mailing lists, and you can find them on the internet. And everything is out there for anyone to see. And a lot of the developer communication happens on a mailing list called PGSQL-Hackers.
Mm.
Um, and that is different than other open source developer communities. I think maybe there are some other ones that use mailing lists as the primary form of communication too. But
Well,
if
I think
Go ahead.
back in the 90s, that was what everybody did because that was about the only technology that existed. Um, as time went on, other people have switched to other methods like GitHub or web forums or whatever. And the Postgres community is maybe a little stuck in the mud, and we haven't changed that. Uh, it is interesting, we're sitting here doing this on Discord, and I see that uh, Robert Haas has started up a Discord server, and there's some conversations happening on that now. So I don't know if that'll become a bigger thing or not. But as of today, it's still the case. The mailing lists are the main thing.
And then over the years, over the 26 years that you've been participating in and contributing to the Postgres community, do you do you feel like your, I don't know, email etiquette or email best practices have gotten better? And I'm curious if there's particular things that you've had to get better at. Um,
Mm, as I already mentioned, I think I've gotten more polite, or at least be more aware of trying to be more polite. Uh, and there's a bunch of skills involved in that. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that when you start working on something, you have an idea for something, you really have to learn how to sell that idea to other people in the community, because otherwise it's probably not going to get accepted. Even if you're a contributor, you have to convince other people this is a good idea before you can get away with committing it. Um, so you have to develop skills of presenting your idea and explaining why it's a good thing or why it's better than what we have, and interacting with people. Almost always somebody else will have some ideas that make your idea better. You have to be able to hear that feedback and say, "Oh, yeah, that is a good idea," and adapt what you're doing. So we always encourage people to try to do that before they've written a whole lot of code, because otherwise they may end up throwing a lot of it away and doing it over. Uh, so there's that, and I already referred to um, listening to users' problems to see what needs to be worked on.
okay.
Don't have any other thoughts
To
right
me,
now, offhand.
tone of voice is just an interesting thing in email. Um, I I sometimes find myself dropping an emoji, or I probably use too much punctuation, right? But I'm trying to sometimes be positive and, make sure that my words don't get misinterpreted with a wrong
mm,
tone of voice, with a more negative or more critical tone of voice.
mm.
Um, so it's tricky. You said something to me earlier though about how certain, you call them verbal mannerisms. I don't know if you have an example. There may be figures of speech that you do not use because you feel like non-native English speakers may not understand those. Is that right?
Yeah, when if I'm in a vacuum, I'll tend to, uh, write things that might be, I guess you might call it faintly archaic English. It was sort of a way that I
I
tend to
need
write a lot.
I need an
Um,
example to understand that.
oh, yeah. Um,
Putting you on the spot. Sorry.
I'm drawing a blank, but I mean, probably wouldn't have to go back further than a couple of weeks in the hackers list to find instances of somebody complaining about this comment in the code looks a little strange to me. Is it really good English? And uh, I say, yeah, it's perfectly good English. I wrote it, but but in point of fact, it's written in a style that you don't see people using all that much anymore.
Okay.
Um, I think
Maybe
probably
someone on the live chat will come up with something and give us an example, or maybe you'll think of one later in today's conversation. Um,
okay.
but
Um,
the point is you have these faintly archaic English, mannerisms, and you try to avoid them so that more people can understand you. That's the gist of it.
yeah, yeah. Because particularly the last, I don't know how many years, it seems like we have more and more contributors whose native language is not English. Um, and so I'm more aware of that than I used to be, and I try not to write things that might be hard to understand. I don't know how well I succeed at that, but I know there's something to worry about. Mhm.
All right. So I want to ask you, okay, a little bit of context. Years ago, I took a year off to write a book. I wrote a book. It's a trunk novel. It'll never get published because it's so bad. But as I did that, I paid a lot of attention to like what should my writing routine be every day, and what do other successful published authors do? And one of the tips was that you sit down and you don't get up. You can't make tea. You can't make toast. All the millions of things that might distract you or cause you to procrastinate or whatever. No, you stay sitting and you focus on, writing until it's all out of your system. Now that's different, obviously, than being a developer on Postgres. But I'm curious what your routine is every day. Like, what time of day do you work best? Do you time box different kinds of work? Like, do you have particular weird eccentric habits that maybe make you a better problem solver or more creative? You already mentioned caffeine, so we know about your Diet Coke that's sitting on your desk.
It, uh, I don't know. Normal routine is, I get up and for breakfast, look at the mailing list to see what's going on. Um, and David Rowley alluded to this in his podcast. Um, you frequently don't find out what you're going to work on that day until you've seen what problems came in on the mailing list. And if I see something that looks like, looks like a bug, I think I know where to fix it. So I might go off and spend the day doing that. Um, if nothing like that happens, then I'll pick up one or other project that I've been working on. Um, or lately, that actually more often translates to reviewing somebody else's patch rather than working on something that I'm originating. Uh, say that I'm definitely not a morning person, so I'd say I probably do my best work in the afternoon. Um, and one of the things that is hard about this sort of working from home, yeah, okay, I should probably back up about steps here and say that the last time I went into an office on a regular basis was probably about the third or fourth year of grad school. Um, since then, it's been almost exclusively working from home. So one of the bad things about that is it's quite difficult to separate uh, work from not work. Yeah, and that's why you often still find me responding on the mailing lists in the evening hours. If I don't have a reason to go out of the house, I'll just continue to sit around and think about Postgres most nights. Um,
My
so,
husband has commented that about me too, ever since I started working from home, which would have been for me 2020. I wonder why that
mm,
was. Um,
it,
I already worked a lot, but he says I work more now than I used to. And it is
mm,
that difficulty of separating it. But I think if you love what you do, like I'm not going to feel guilty about that. Do you feel guilty about it? Do you
in the
feel
least.
like it hurts you?
Uh,
Wait, you said not
well,
in the least or in the least?
uh,
Wait, what did you say?
I said not in the least.
Okay.
Um,
So you
the
enjoy it.
I do. I mean, it's something I'm good at, something I enjoy doing. So otherwise, I would have gotten burned out long ago, I'm sure. But
Um, would you describe your work on Postgres as more creative or more analytical? Or dot dot dot.
more an analytical kind of guy. I don't think of myself as being particularly creative. Uh, I have found that as things go on, as time goes on, I frequently am able to suggest ideas that other people maybe hadn't thought of, but it often feels to me like I'm suggesting something that's just obvious based on all my experience, rather than something being, really novel.
I'm guessing that it's probably not just obvious to everyone, though, just because your experience is so different from so what's obvious to you is potentially novel to someone else. And I think that works in all sorts of directions,
Mhm.
right? We all bring our background and our history and our baggage with us, that sometimes will make us see things that other people don't. Hmm. Okay. So you think of yourself as more analytical, but I
Mhm.
can't imagine how you do the work you do if it's not also creative. So we're just gonna have to agree to disagree on that one, I
Okay.
suppose. Okay. Um, I want to know if there's any favorite tools you use in your development work on Postgres or any unfavorite tools too. What tools do you use? Period.
Uh, Most of my development habits were set a pretty long time ago. I use Emacs for editing and mostly GDB for debugging. Uh, there's pretty standard tools like perf. Uh, Occasionally played around with, not even sure what the word I want is here, visual development environments, and just never felt like that was the right thing for me.
Okay, dumb question here. When you use modern day Emacs for editing code, does it have all the kind of syntax highlighting that the IDEs have these days? Because I know
Uh,
I back when I used VI for editing source code, there was no syntax.
um, well, the main thing I rely on is it does auto indenting and stuff pretty well. Um, I actually don't like syntax highlighting. I find it hard to read.
Okay.
It's an eyesight kind of thing more than anything else.
You told me before you have a really big monitor. Is it just 1 or 2? It doesn't
It's
matter.
one.
Okay.
It's one.
So what do you do when you go on vacation, and do you wanna bring a little bit of work with you, which maybe you leave it all behind. But if you did bring your laptop with you, do you also bring a monitor?
No, no. I carry the biggest laptop I can get. These days, it's MacBook 16-inch.
Okay.
And I can work on that. I just prefer to have more screen space. So,
Alright. So now, I before we go back to Postgres, the technology, I'm also curious about time management. And you talked about how you do all that, like, interrupt-driven work first thing in the morning, you're looking at the mailing list over breakfast, over Cheerios, if I remember correctly. Um, and but are there any other time management techniques that help you get things done by, I don't know, whatever the deadlines are, the commit fests, which happen, every other month? Is that right? And obviously, the Postgres releases once a year, and code freezes in the spring, and the actual GA releases in the fall. And I'm talking Northern Hemisphere spring and fall there, I guess. Um, but are there any other time management techniques that you've developed over the years that help you?
I'm pretty awful at time management, I would say. Um, I can when I get sucked into a problem, I can get into the zone and just sit there and think about it for hours. Um, Even if there's something else I should be doing instead.
I'm glad that didn't happen today. I'm glad you're here and not
So,
sucked into a Postgres problem.
well, that's because I
Um,
have a calendar app. I do use that, but
okay. Um, I actually think it's really cool when you are so deeply involved in a question or a problem, or a project that you lose track of time. For me, it's like it's a sign that you're doing the right kinds of work.
yeah, yeah. I mean, if you never find yourself doing that, then you have to kind of ask yourself if you're in the right line of work. I think, at least for people like us who are fortunate enough to be able to be in this sort of job in the first place. Um, you really have to look for something that just fits your way of thinking and fits what you find interesting to do. Because if it doesn't, you can go find something else that does fit you better.
All right, so let's pivot to Postgres for a second. You talked about the importance of, like, reading emails and interacting with people who are actual Postgres users on the mailing list.
Mm.
Um, but I know that there's no one setting a roadmap for Postgres, right? It's not so many software projects, particularly ones that are primarily run by a single company, right? There is someone setting direction, like saying this is going to be the theme of this release, or these are the kinds of features that are a must have for our enterprise customers, or whatever. Um, but Postgres doesn't have that. It's very, in many ways, bottoms up in terms of what patches get submitted. Um, so how do you, as an individual, decide like what parts of Postgres you're going to work on for each release?
Mm, well, I don't have a roadmap either. I mean, I maybe could develop one, but just it's not something that attracts me to have. Uh, I have relatively short term, well, usually relatively short term things that I think about and work on for a few months, and that's done, and I go on to something else. Uh, the can only think of one really large multi-year project that I've done in the past, which was the thing to attach outer join nulling information to variables. I probably don't even want to try to explain what that is on this podcast, but it was something that took several years to get done. Yeah, and there's fallout that's still being worked on by me and other people to uh, actually derive the advantages that the idea has. Richard Guo has committed some stuff recently, for example, flew that fell out of that work. Uh, but mostly, I prefer to work on smaller projects where you can get some gratification in a period of weeks or months rather than years.
Okay. Well, so that actually is a perfect lead in to let's talk about how if you were to step back and assess how your time gets spent, right? There's contributing as an author, as a developer, but you also spend time reviewing other people's patches,
Mhm.
committing other people's patches, collaborating with other people on their work, on the mailing list in particular. Um, do you have a sense of like percentage wise how much time you spent in kind of each of those different areas of focus?
I think lately it's been mostly reviewing and committing other people's patches. That's probably more than half my time. Um, and then, there's been another big fragment that's just interacting with the community. That goes down to looking at people's problems and things like that. The things that I do that's are totally my own work or just not that big a part of my day anymore. I miss that a little bit, but until an idea comes along for something that I want to work on, it's you know hard to make that part the bigger part of the day.
And among the different things that you do, whether it's answering like PGSQL bugs emails or reviewing other people's work, chiming in on the mailing list, do you have favorites? Are there things that you find more, I don't know, motivating or that make you happier?
I still like designing and writing code the best, and helping improve somebody else's code is a little bit below that.
Okay. But obviously helping improve someone else's code is, I suppose, the reason you do it is it helps you get scale. It helps the project get scale.
Yeah, exactly. If the project were still the size it was back in the late '90s, we would not be anywhere near where we are today. So I have to spend a great deal of my time on helping out other people. It's just the nature of the beast.
All right. So I also wanted to talk to you about time zones. And this is something that I struggle with. Um, like now there's tools where you can schedule an email to be sent at a particular time of day or schedule, I don't know, in my case a Teams chat or a Slack chat or whatever it is to be sent later. But the Postgres community is global. Nighttime for you is morning for someone else. But some people, if they receive an email from you, might feel like they've got to jump on it now, even though it's Friday night at 11 p.m. where they are, or a weekend, or whatever. Um, Someone gave me feedback once that said, you really shouldn't send Teams chats to your employees after 6 p.m. because it makes them stressed. And I was kinda like, "Well, but, like, we work different hours, and that's okay. There's no expectation that they respond, like, when they're having dinner or when they're, out with friends that night or whatever." But anyway, I struggle with it. So I'm wondering how you think about time zones and that whole, like, giving people grace so that they can take a break from their work and they don't feel like they have to respond to you right away.
Well, I certainly never expect that somebody has to respond to me right away. It is I think one of the big advantages of email is that it is asynchronous. You know, you can send a message to somebody who maybe is on the other side of the world and is asleep right now, or at least, not at their desk. And when they get back to you, be you will no longer be awake. So it slows things down a little bit, I guess, but it just is a good way to work for a project that's it's spread out as we are. Um, you just have to not expect that there's going to be an instantaneous answer.
Um, you mentioned something about friendships. I mean, you've worked on this project for 26 years. I'm assuming there's a whole bunch of friendships that have come up along the way.
Um, Mostly people I see at conferences, and have been going to conferences with them for, well, decades now. Um, it's, a big part of the reason why I stay in the community is I'm friends with a bunch of people.
Well, and when it comes to conferences, so I think it's fair to say that you're not to stereotype, but you're more introverted than I am, I'm guessing. Is that would you describe yourself as
Oh,
an introvert?
I definitely would.
Okay. But you still enjoy Postgres conferences. You don't need to be an extrovert to enjoy them, right?
Well,
I'm trying to lead the
that's not,
witness
I
here.
mean, um, I enjoy them and I'm not an extrovert. So there you have it.
Okay. So, no, the reason I bring that up is I guess I'm leading to the fact that I think for me, like I feel so at home at Postgres conferences, which is pretty amazing given that I've only worked in this community for 7.5 years, compared to your 26 years. I have as many years in the boat. And um, to that extent, my friendships aren't as deep as yours probably are, but I go to these Postgres conferences and it's just wonderful. It's really cool. And I think I've met people who are contributors to the community and they also feel like that. But I've also met a lot of users at some of these. I was just at PGConf New York City last week, and
Mm.
PGConf EU is coming up. It changes cities in Europe every year. This year, it's usually in October, and this year it's going to be in Athens, Greece. Um, PGConf Dev is where I last saw you in person, right? And that's the one that happens in Canada,
Right.
um, usually in May. So I guess I'm fishing for if somebody is listening to this and they are a user of Postgres or maybe a new contributor, but they've never been and they're wondering, should I go? What would you tell them?
I'd say, yeah, if there is a conference is convenient for you to get to, you should give it a try. Um, this is, I think, a wonderful community.
All right. So I think I'm gonna drop the link in for PGConf EU in particular. I don't know if it's sold out yet or not. It usually does sell out before the conference day. But if anybody does listen to this after we publish in a couple of days and they're available the week of October 22nd and it's not yet sold out, I just want them to know about it. I also think that all the talks from this year's PGConf EU are going to be well, not all the talks, many of the talks, the ones where the speaker has given permission, are likely going to be published on YouTube afterwards, which is pretty cool. Yes, and I just got confirmation from Daniel Gustafson. Talks will be recorded. Um, there's another conference I'm involved in called Posette, an event for Postgres. It's put together on behalf of or by Microsoft, but we have participation from people all over the world, from all sorts of different companies. And what I like about that is it's all virtual, so you don't even have to travel to participate and to benefit. All right, I'll get off my talk soapbox now. Um, so I suspect, Tom, that it's hard to remember what it was like to be new to the Postgres project because that's 26 years ago, and I certainly there's a lot about 26 years ago that I've forgotten. Um,
Yeah.
and also the Postgres project is totally different now than it was in 1998. I
Yeah.
hazard that there are more contributors, uh, more components, more features, different tooling. Like lots of
Yeah.
things are different. But
Yeah. I think it's um, also our standards have gone up enormously. Um, I remember that, I've been around the project for probably not much more than about 6 months of doing any serious amount of work. And uh, they gave me a commitment saying, we're tired of committing stuff for you. And now, obviously, it's usually a multi-year journey for somebody to become a committer, which is basically because there is just a bigger amount of code now that you have to be familiar with in order to have a reasonable chance of not breaking things. So we have to be more careful. We use whatever tools we can to try to catch bugs. That's why we have all this testing infrastructure that didn't exist back in the day. Uh, and it's just a bigger, more complicated environment than it was when I got started. But I guess the advice I would give for a new person is to try to pick some small area to make a difference in, um, and study that area. Pick something that you're interested in that you have ideas about how to make better, and even then start small. If you start with a very ambitious patch, um, it's going to take forever to get anywhere, and you're likely to get burned out before you get done. So pick some relatively small idea to do first. And I talked to her already about getting feedback on the mailing lists about how selling people on your idea can help make it better. So that is how I would approach things, I think, if I were coming in new.
I think that's the thing that doesn't come naturally to a lot of people, particularly people who aspire to do really good work. It's very easy to toil away on your own to make sure that what you're producing is really, really good before you share it.
Mhm.
And learning that hack, if you will, that hey, sharing something early, even before it's polished and perfect, is
Mm.
going to yield something better in the end.
Right.
Um, and I don't know, it took me years to figure that one out.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually
but
can give an example. Um, Very recent, something I'm still working on. Uh, Somebody complained on the mailing lists that if they were writing an extension script and it had an error in it, that our error reporting for that totally sucked. There was no context as to what the error was or where it was. Um, so that's an instance of, and I got interested in doing something about that, which is an instance of the pattern I mentioned before about listening to users. Um, and I, wrote a quick hack that was by no means meant to be committed and put that up on the list. Just say, uh, what do you think about doing something like this? And, it's been through 3 or 4 iterations now, and it's still not committed. So if you went and looked in the current commit fest, you could find that link pretty quickly. But that I think is sort of development process works well in this community is, excuse me, share something early and improve it over time rather than expecting that you can, show up out of nowhere with a perfect patch. It's just really the hard way to do it.
I love that example. Um, but it's still hard, particularly if you feel like you're going to be judged, and maybe the idea still has warts or rough edges um or hair on it. So
Mhm.
um how do you get past that notion that, and it's public, right? It's all
Right.
out there for everyone to see.
Yeah. The This goes back to the thing we discussed earlier of need to develop a little bit of a thick skin, uh, because if you approach it wrong, you're going to take any comments on your idea or your patch as criticism, and that is not a good way to react to it. You have to understand that everybody wants to make things better, and if they comment on your patch and say, "Why don't you do it like this?" They're hoping to get to a better spot, and you ought to respond to it in that spirit. Uh, the other thing
Well, and
that's the other thing that I'm not sure that people entirely get all the time is that, um, frankly, an awful lot of ideas, awful lot of ideas are not good. And, yeah, you come along and say, "Why don't we do it like this?" And there are actually good reasons not to do it like that. Uh, so that's another reason not to spend too much time on something before you present it. Is that maybe somebody will shoot it down for good reasons. So it's just the mindset you have to adopt that you're looking for ways to improve Postgres, and some of your ideas will be good, some will be bad, some maybe can get to be good with some tweaking.
yeah, I've often told people that, like, in the kind of work that I do, where English is my programming language now, right? I
Mhm,
I no longer, other than YAML and HTML and some website stuff, I'm not an active developer anymore.
mhm.
Um, but I'll often say my rough drafts suck. They're just really bad. But that's okay. And getting my rough drafts out there and getting that early feedback makes the end result so much better and gives me new ideas. And sometimes I'll pivot. Sometimes I'll just leave a lot on the cutting room floor. Um, but yeah, you gotta have to embrace that mindset. All right. So, if anybody's listening and they are a developer and they're thinking about getting more involved in the Postgres community, um, where would you point them? What should they go look at?
Um,
We talked about the mailing list, obviously.
about the mailing lists, we have a thing called the Commit Fest app, which is sort of a scoreboard of patches that are being worked on. Um, if you're interested in, oh, I should back up here and say that one of the best things to do to help learn about the code if you're a new person is to review other people's patches, uh, because that will help you look at the code and look at what other people are doing, and along the way you can actually make a useful contribution even if you don't know very much. At the very least, you can say, "Boy, this is not obvious. Can you make it clearer or at least comment it better?" Uh, so even in very small ways, like just testing a patch to see if it does what you would like it to do. So I would encourage new people to try to review patches. The way to find things that are in need of review is to look at them on the just look through the CommitFest app, see what's going on there. Um, we also have, I mentioned earlier, testing infrastructure. There's a thing called Build Farm, which is a pool of machines running all different operating systems, and they're just continually running all the regression tests we have against whatever the current development tip is. Uh, so we keep an eye on that, see what's breaking in the Build Farm. Um, let's see.
I know that in the last episode of Talking Postgres, we had Melanie Plageman here as a guest because she and Richard Gao, who you mentioned earlier, are the two newest Postgres committers. They
Mhm.
were both invited to become committers earlier in 2024, back in April, if I remember correctly. And Melanie said she does a ton of learning. She's a runner, apparently.
Mhm.
And she does a lot of learning by downloading conference talks from Postgres conferences and listening to those as she's running and listening to some of the Postgres podcasts as well. So it's a way she can get two things done at once. Um, I don't know if that'll work for some people, uh, but I thought I'd throw that out there. Well, Tom, uh, unless you have other tips about ways to learn more, I have made it through all of the topics. I mean, we went through a lot of chapters, right? We talked about high school, your undergraduate years at Carnegie Mellon, Hewlett Packard years, grad school, the Coke machine, structured software systems, libjpeg, and then Postgres. And I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through kind of how you ended up here. Um, and I suppose if I'm going to ask one last question, it would be if there's a favorite part of the Postgres community, or something that is like a magnet or a North Star that kind of keeps you coming back to Postgres day after day, besides the paycheck from Crunchy Data to do so.
Well, I don't know. I just hold on a second. My cat's doing something weird over here. I'll be right.
No problem. I'm allergic to cats, so maybe one of the benefits of this podcast being recorded remotely is that I don't have to be near your cat.
Right. Okay. He stopped. So he's
Okay.
making a distressing amount of noise for a little while there. Um, no, I just, enjoy being part of this community. I enjoy working on this code. Um, I don't have anything deeper than that, I'm afraid.
So the technology and the people, um,
Mhm.
and all these long-standing relationships. Cool. All right. Well, I want to say thank you, Tom, for joining us. And the next episode, episode 21 of Talking Postgres, is also going to be recorded live. And that will be on Wednesday, November 13th at 10 a.m. PST. Because we will have changed time zones by that point in November. The guest is Andrew Atkinson, and the topic in November will be helping Rails developers learn Postgres. So if you want to mark your calendar now to be part of that live recording, you can go to aka.ms/talking postgres EP21 cal. You can also get to past episodes and links to subscribe on all the different podcast platforms at talkingpostgres.com. And transcripts are included on the episode pages on talkingpostgres.com too. And before we leave, if you have enjoyed this podcast, and I hope you have, please tell your friends in person, social media, however you share your recommendations to your friends and your followers. If you use social media, the hashtag is Talking Postgres, all one word. And word of mouth is definitely one of the best ways for people to discover um, this podcast. And a big thank you to everybody who enjoyed the live recording and participated in the text chat today on Discord. Thank you, Tom. It's a wrap.
Thank you.